The 10th anniversary of Palazzo Falson that we are commemorating today has been a moment to step back and take stock. And the stock we found was a lot of research that had been building up and deserved to see the light of day. We did this 5 years ago when we celebrated our 5th anniversary, and on that occasion a number of our volunteers delivered presentations on their research in our archives. 5 years later, we are turning to external researchers to present the research they have been doing in connection with the museum and its history. But for a moment, allow me to reminisce. 10 years have passed in the blink of an eye. I still remember my first day at work over a decade ago in the ever-beautiful, freshly renovated Palazzo Falson that Fondazione Patrimonio Malti had worked so bravely on. That sense of excitement has never left me. But how do you sustain excitement? By discovering the hidden stories of the museum's artifacts, hidden facts in the museum archives, by getting to know Olof Gollcher and his family history better, and by making new friends, new collaborations, and taking the museum forward to make it relevant to a contemporary audience. During our first decade, we have built up a loyal circle of friends who support the museum. We have had countless students, interns, and many wonderful volunteers who have helped in many ways. We have created networks with other museums in Malta and overseas. We host various museum groups, visiting societies, school children, heads of state, art-loving housewives, those are my favorite, and lots of other interest groups. We have generated exhibitions which focused on little-known areas of the decorative arts, ranging from whistles to snuff boxes. We have provided a platform for researchers and academics to share their knowledge in public lectures. And we've also rolled up our sleeves and created art workshops for children and for adults. But the museum looks forward, and we look to all of you to sustain us with your presence. So thank you for being here today. But thank you also for coming round to visit the museum on occasion, and for recommending us to your friends. And you can also be part of our museum by becoming a friend of the museum. We repay your support with lots of interesting events and an annual trip abroad. This year Vienna is on the cards. And if you have the time and interest, we would welcome new recruits to join our existing fold of multi-talented volunteers. I see a number of them amongst the audience today. There are more details at the back of the hall, and Jeanette, who like me has been at Palazzo Falson for a decade, will be able to answer all your queries. In all of this, the giant figure of Maurice de Giorgio looms large. His was the guiding hand that saw the museum project completed and started up to the public. I do have a little presentation here that I'd like to switch on. You'll see some images of Maurice de Giorgio, much missed by us. Although he passed away 2 years ago, he will never be forgotten. Michael Lowell, our CEO, continues his legacy in a brilliant and remarkably creative way, and our superb team at Palazzo Falson ensure the smooth running of the museum. I might be the one who is speaking here today, but it is thanks to all these people that the museum runs well, under the steady hand of our present chairman, Joseph Grioli, who gamely stepped into the breach when Maurice de Giorgio passed. So that's Palazzo Falson's 10 years in a nutshell. Now let us look at today. Today's event is part of a calendar of activities celebrating the museum's decade of operations by Fondazione Patrimonio Malti. Apart from the seminar, which is obviously today, there will be an open day on Sunday 28 May, that's next Sunday week, and the forthcoming edition of Treasures of Malta will be entirely dedicated to Palazzo Falson. But today we present a number of groundbreaking studies that cover Gollcher family history and legacy. We are starting with Professor Cecilia Lindhé, who has some answers for Ollie. If one goes through the archive at Palazzo Falson, it becomes clear that Olof Gollcher, Ollie to his friends, was trying to trace the family's origins not only to Sweden in the 19th century, but even earlier than that. His research was widespread, from Scandinavia to Puerto Rico, and many other countries and places in between. But many of his questions remained unanswered. Cecilia's research has unearthed a lot of interesting facts about the family's origin, and she will be telling us more about her unfolding research ahead of publication. Tom Folks has kindly made the trip from London to speak to us about the strong connections between our museum and his, due to the Gollcher donations. It has long been a shared dream of ours to present this information to the public, and I am so glad that this event has provided us with the opportunity to hear about these donations. Daniel Gullo will be speaking to us from across the ocean in a recorded presentation about the wonderful work of the Malta Study Centre in Minnesota and our collaboration. He is represented here by the site director of the Malta Study Centre, Claudia Garadas, who will introduce the presentation. More details on the speakers and this morning's programme are on the leaflets placed on your chairs. You will also notice an unmarked white envelope. Needless to say, a little appeal to us to request any monetary donations you feel you can offer for the continued operation of the museum. Now, before passing the word, I would like to thank the speakers for their contributions and the Michael Marks Charitable Trust for their help, Corinthia Hotels and Infinitely Shara, and naturally the supporters of Patrimonio who back us all the way. I would also like to thank the Olof Gollcher Art and Archaeological Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for the introduction and for inviting me to take part of the celebrations of Palazzo Falson's 10th year anniversary. I also like to take the opportunity to thank you for opening up the archives at the Palazzo and also offering me a workspace to work while I'm in Malta. And also extend this gratitude to the staff and the volunteers at Palazzo Falson for helping me with finding material and always being there assisting me, answering all my questions. And also, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Carl Gollcher and Mark Gollcher for giving me access to the archives, the Consular Archives in Valletta, for providing me with a place to work, and also for being so generous with your time and patience to all my questions. Now, this started to sound like a speech at the Oscar Gala, and it's not. But still, and before I continue and delve into the family history, I would like to quote the Swedish author Fredrika Bremer, whom I will return to in a while. She visited Malta in 1858, and this is what she wrote about her visit. I came to Malta without knowing a single person, but I soon found me surrounded by friends. Malta has given me much more food for thought and heart than I had ever expected. You can relax. This is not an old member of the Swedish branch, but this is the almond priest Beckenram. He is one of the finest Egyptian mummies at the Mediterranean Museum in Stockholm. He was mummified around 600 BC. We know his name and title. We also know that he belonged to a family that had held priestly offices for generations. And here he's being x-rayed at Linköping University Hospital some 10 years ago. He was x-rayed in the 1960s and 1980s also, and he was closely followed by press and TV at the time, so he's actually quite famous in Sweden. Probably one of the oldest persons also to be examined at the University Hospital in Sweden. How and when, in the official reports, he came to Stockholm, we didn't know, up till now. And this is where my interaction with the history of the Gollcher family begins, with this mummy. And I will return to the Beckenram story in a while. Today I will try to answer some of Olof Gollcher's questions regarding the family's connection to Sweden. Some are still under investigation, but hopefully they will be answered eventually, and the work will for sure continue after this presentation. Olof, as Francesca said, was very interested in the family history, as the letters and notes in the archive at Palazzo Falson show. During the 1950s and 1960s, Olof corresponded with Erik Forsman, a relative living in Stockholm. They wrote about health matters, of course, that's what you do, and Erik often writes about the cold Swedish weather. He even tries to start a collaboration between the Swedish government and the Maltese government in getting tourists from Sweden to Malta, but he doesn't succeed. There's also a very interesting story about how the King of Sweden gets to read one of Olof Gollcher's research pieces, and he's very impressed by it. And there are many more stories like that could be followed up. Olof Fredrik asked Erik Forsman to investigate when the family came to Sweden, what their occupation were, when they moved to Stockholm, from Göteborg, and so on. And they corresponded quite intensely during the parts of the 1950s. And just to set the scene of the family history, I will give you a quick recap now of how the family ancestry what it looks like, for those of you who are not familiar with it. And in a bit, I will dig a bit deeper into it. So Johan Gottfried Gollcher, he moves to Gothenburg from Danzig in the 18th century. He marries Gertrud Olsson, and together they have 10 children. Many of them, as you see, die very young. His son, Olof Gollcher, marries Anna Dorothea Geppert. Together they have 8 children. 3 of them die very young. The daughter, Kristina Maria, she dies a couple of weeks after her birth, and a twin sister, Gertrud Elisabeth, dies in June the same year, as does their 2-year-old son, Johan Gottfried, all in an outbreak of pox. Olof's son, Johan Gustav Gollcher, he moves to Stockholm with his wife and 2 sons and a daughter, and later they get another daughter. Here he starts a shipping business together with partners. They sail to the Mediterranean, importing, among other things, lemons and oranges to Stockholm. During one of the voyages, his son, Olof Fredrik, he fell ill in Malta, and when the ship left Valletta, he was not listed as a passenger. So Olof Fredrik stayed in Malta, married Vincenza Bruno, and they have 10 children. Olof Fredrik later became consul of Sweden and Norway, first in 1870 as acting consul, and then in 1874 he took over the consulate. One of his sons, Gustav Gollcher, was the father of Olof Gollcher, the Olof Gollcher who is at the center of our attention today. So now you've seen parts of the Gollcher family tree, but it is much, much bigger. And I will show you here a work in progress. This is not the Maltese branch, it's been taken out. And this family tree is made by Anton Larsson, who is a student at the University of Gothenburg. He had digged deep into the archives, and he has found so many interesting stories, fascinating stories. And he even emailed me yesterday telling me about one of them moving to Uruguay, becoming a captain there. So there's so many more stories to tell, and it's quite extensive. And Anton and I, we work quite closely. He has, much of the things that I'm presenting here is also part of what he has found. And we are applying for more research money together. So what I will be doing now is to go back in history to trace the Gollchers in Gothenburg and Stockholm. I will only be able to highlight some parts of the family history now, which is a pity because I could go on and on for a very long time. It's such an interesting and fascinating story. And tracing it, I've been moved, I've been amazed, I've been impressed. And it also turns out that the family played, could continue to play, a central role in our understanding of Swedish history and about the history of Gothenburg in particular. So now let me take you back to the 18th century Gothenburg. The city was founded in 1621 by Gustav II Adolf, or Gustavus Adolphus. This is an early map from the 17th century. Here is an image of the city from the early 18th century. Not much is left now, but one thing is the so-called Skansen Lejonet, the Lion Scouts. It's a fortress that was built in 1687, and you see it there in the front to the right. During the 18th century, Gothenburg had developed into a proper town. It had more than 10,000 inhabitants, partly thanks to the East India Company, who was founded in Gothenburg in 1731. Together with, for example, the export of iron, wood, and herring, and herring is playing a crucial role in the Gollcher history. The merchants were getting richer and richer. They built big houses down by the canal. Unfortunately, not many of those are left because there were several very big fires in Gothenburg at the end of the 18th century. So not many of those buildings are left. So this is the city scene that Johan Gottfried Gollcher enters when he leaves Danzig in the 1750s. Still, we don't know exactly when he arrived in Gothenburg. The earliest record we found is the certificate of baptism of Elisabeth Gollcher, his first child. The record is from the German parish church, and this is the earliest evidence that Gottfried lived in Gothenburg. Unfortunately, Elisabeth died when she was only 5 years old. When Johan Gottfried came to Gothenburg, he had a formal training as a cooper from Danzig, which means that he was an artisan, a master of making barrels and caskets. Since he didn't have a valid license to do that in Sweden, Swedish bureaucracy started quite early. He had to complete a qualifying piece. And in 1761, he gets a membership in the so-called Tunnbindarskrået, the Cooper Guild. And on the 10th of June in 1763, he wins a citizenship in the city. In 1770, Gottfried and his wife Gertrude leaves Gothenburg and they move to a small island just in the mouth of the river called Stora Aspholmen. Gottfried will now start a new job as a cooper master in one of the first really big industries on the west coast, namely an industry that took care of all the herring. The late 18th century was one of the great herring periods in Sweden. Periodically, herrings came to the shores of the west coast, especially Bohuslän, which is a landscape a bit further up, in such an abundance that it became industry for export. And those herrings periods, they usually lasted about 30 to 70 years, and they have been described from medieval times. During such a period in the 18th century, the herring came in such an abundance that they also boiled so-called tranolja, an oil for burning lamps, fish oil for burning lamps, and they also exported this. And the smell of this is actually something that Mary Wollstonecraft mentions in her letters from traveling on the Swedish west coast. Herring was called the silver of the sea, turning the otherwise extremely poverty-stricken population of Bohuslän into riches as long as it lasted. Now, this is not from the factory that Gottfried worked, but this actually is. We have found an image of Lilla Aspholmen, and the building to the left is actually the factory where Johan Gottfried worked where he worked when he came to Stora Aspholmen. It's fantastic to be able to have an image of it. And this is the island's Stora Aspholmen from the mainland. So the west coast was very much in need of Gollcher's skills, and the cooper trade was extremely important for exporting herring and also for building an industry, the development of Gothenburg as an industrial city, and it started already there. The family continues to live on Stora Aspholmen until they die. In 1786, the son Olof takes over the business, or the master cooper at Stora Aspholmen, and he also becomes a member of the Cooper Guild. And in 1794, Olof and his wife Anna, Dorothea, they do something quite remarkable and brave at that time. They start their own business. They move to Lilla Aspholmen, which is the one with the red circle, and to the right, it's the Stora Aspholmen where Olof was born and where the factory was, and the third island, is a fortress. And this is indeed a fascinating story of family and business life in the small islands outside of Gothenburg. But it doesn't end here. Both of the small islands are located in the shadow of the great Älvsborgs fortress, which is one of Gothenburg's main tourist attractions. And the fortress was built in the 17th century near the ruins of an old fortress that was built in the 14th century, on a small island where the Göta Älv river meets the sea. It protected the new town, and it had, since medieval times, protected Sweden's only access to the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. And New Älvsborg's fortress is still maintained, and it was here actually Anton has found that Johan Gottfried and his family, they took their small boat from Stora Aspholmen every Sunday to take the communion, and it's also here that their children were baptized while they were living at Stora Aspholmen. Some 10 years ago, Gothenburg city decided that they needed to expand the harbour in this area. So you see Lilla Aspholmen, where Anna and Olof had their house, they lived there and they had their own business on the small island. They're now going to build that in, so they're going to build a harbour over it. It's an industrial area. I think it's Volvo, you see to the right, so it's quite close to where I live, actually, not far at all. But since they're going to build a harbour over Lilla Aspholmen, they need to do an archaeological investigation. You can't just build, so you need to do that. And the dig started in October last year, and the result is fascinating. It's been performed by Bohusläns Museum and led by underwater archaeologist Thomas Bergstrand, and Anton Larsson has also been involved in this work. And what's so remarkable about this archaeological excavation is that this is the first investigation of a factory like this and on the west coast. It's never been excavated before, and it could cast completely new light on the social and life in the islands of Gothenburg. So the person standing there, he's standing close to the house ground of the private home of Olof and Anna, and in the back, further back, you see Stora Aspholmen, where Olof was born. So these are really small, barren islands, but it's a quite beautiful scenery and setting there. They have made a 3D model of the ground. It's intact still, the ground, they found it. Of course, the house is gone, but the ground is still there. And the house was 14 meters long. It was 7 meters wide. It was not a small house. It had 6 rooms. And a house like this could be compared to a better vicarage or an officer's house at the time. And as I said, the house and the factory have been taken down, but the basement ground is still there, and it's built on the rock, directly on the stone rock. They have found parts of a massive kitchen stove and baking oven. The archaeologists have also found traces of 2 tiled stoves, a small chamber stove, and the walls seems to have been white plastered or whitewashed. So it was really a higher middle class house located in this barren and tiny islet. And this 3D model is made by Anders Gutehall, and I was thinking about showing it to you, but things like this never work when you do it in real time. But you can find it on Google, and the address is on the top of it. And you can move around and play with it and see it from different angles. During the dig, they also found a beautiful button from, perhaps it's the button, Anna's button, we don't know, but probably it's been sitting on a dress or something like that. They also found a comb in the ground. I have been told that they found also several pipes. And I think that they found them in Olof's cooper workshop. And it seems as if Olof the older was a devoted pipe smoker, just as Olof the younger was. And I think that it's a beautiful detail that the pipes bridges Olof and Olof, bridges Lilla Aspholmen and Malta, 2 islands together. And they're investigating the area. The dig or the archaeological excavation finished last year, but we are still waiting for the results. They did some underwater archaeological investigations also, which also is a wonderful parallel to Olof's interest, but we're waiting for the result of that. So this is actually Olof Gollcher's and Anna's life work. drawn in a fire insurance from 1794. And the archaeological dig focused on house number 1, which is their private home. The small house behind number 1, number 2, is the cooper workshop where Olof worked. And number 3 is the herring saltery. And number 6 is where they boiled the oil, making lamp oil. So when the herring runs out in 1807, the family leaves Lilla Aspholmen and moves closer to the city of Gothenburg again. Olof works as a ferryman for a couple of years, and around 1812, they move even closer to the city center. And Olof Gollcher, he dies of pneumonia in 1829 when he's 66 years old. That is 3 years before his son, Johan Gustav Gollcher, moves to Stockholm with his little family. Is it not from Messina that the small Swedish sailing ship Svalan, with Captain Gollcher, every spring since many years arrives first of all the swallows to Sweden, bringing a load of lemons and oranges that quickly is spread in the city and allow us citizens of Stockholm to say, "Behold, Svalan has arrived, now spring is here." This entry and tribute to Captain Gollcher was written by the Swedish author Fredrika Bremer, whom I quoted earlier, when she arrived in Messina on her way to Palestine and Malta in 1858. Fredrika Bremer was an internationally well-known author. She published a large number of novels, short stories and travelogues between 1828 and 1861. Her writing marks the birth of the realist novel in Sweden, and her work influenced many of the Victorian novelists, for example, Elisabeth Gaskell and George Eliot. The issue of women's rights was her main concern, and her work had had a great impact on Swedish and international suffrage campaigns and feminist ideology. Furthermore, she was also an experienced traveler. And in 1858, when she was 55 years old, she began on her own a 5-year-long journey to Switzerland, Belgium, France, Italy, Malta, Palestine, to Turkey and Greece. And before that, some years before that, she was also visiting North America. And she was so well known that people were waiting for her, wanting her autographs when she arrived in North America. And she spent 2 years in Cuba. Her stay in Malta is described in this book, Journey to the Old World. Unfortunately, it has not been translated into English. But here she writes about the history of the nights, about the topography, and the people she met. And she enjoyed the company of many families in Malta. And I would like to talk to you about it later, perhaps, to see whether you know some of these families. She met Prince Albert when he was here, and she very much enjoyed the company of her compatriot, Gollcher. And I quote, "The son of Captain Gollcher, who brought lemons from Messina to Stockholm every spring." She met with the 2 boys when she was here. Must have been Gustav, father of Olof, and who was born in 1854, and James, who was born in 1857. They are Swedish boys, durch und durch, through and through, she writes. She stayed with the family some nights, actually, and Olof Fredrik also took her on in his carriage. She visited Undina, St. Paul's Brae, and some of the excavations. And there's so much more to say about Bremer's visit, but I only wanted to highlight it because here we have Sweden's most famous author writing about the family. And it would be wonderful to find some records here in Malta about Bremer's visit. I haven't been able to dig into that yet. But this quote also anchors us in Stockholm. In 1832, Johan Gustav Gollcher, the son of Olof and Anna, moves with his family to Stockholm. But already in 1825, while living in Gothenburg, he had taken command of the vessel Svalan, that you can see a painting of at the Palazzo Falson. He remained in command of this vessel until 1837, when he took over Svalan II, which was owned by James Patton in Stockholm. James Patton became not only a close friend of the family, but Johan and James became ship owner in partnership together with a company called Lovén and Company. And I recently found that there's this big archive of the Patton family at the National Archives in Stockholm, and just a couple of years ago they got a big photo collection of old photographs of Patton's friends and family. So as soon as I can, I will go to Stockholm and see whether there are any more photos of the Gollcher family. And this is the house in Stockholm where the three partners had their office. It's located at Skeppsbron, and Skeppsbron is a very, very nice area. It's one of the best areas in Stockholm. And it's called the Tvenska huset. The house has an interesting story. It was built by Nicodemus Tessin the Elder. It's an important Swedish architect. And the house is actually located very close to the Royal Palace in Stockholm. And if we follow the small street to the left, we immediately enter the old city of Stockholm. So this is what they had. You see it here from a bird's eye, and this is like images from the old town of Stockholm. This was their office. They had a private home at Brännkyrkogatan. This is the house, and it still stands today. It's also a very, very beautiful house. And I'm a bit interested in these things, so I wanted to know how long did it take for him to go to his office. And it took, today it would have taken 11 minutes. So it's not far from the private home to the office, and it's a beautiful area of Stockholm, really, really beautiful. And this is a journey that Olof Fredrik made in the 1950s. They visited the office. You see the office up there to the right. And they also visited the home, the private home down to the right. And Erik Forsman told Olof then that they're going to demolish this house because of the new city plans of Stockholm, but that never happened. So the house is actually still there. And they visited the graves as well. So the Gollcher family was prominent and well known in Stockholm, and I have got through all the newspapers from 1827. That's when they were first mentioned. They figure very often. There's even a fictionalized story, a short story about what happened when Olof Fredrik ended up in Malta, and there are many fantastic episodes, and they're not true at all. But it's fascinating that they had a short story in the newspapers about this. And so they were very well known, very respected. And when Johan Gustav passed away, the ships in Stockholm harbour were all flagging at half-mast during that day. So, as I told you earlier, Johan Gustav had two sons. And there are some interesting stories about Karl and his children that I won't have time to go into today. But Olof Fredrik, you know the story about Olof Fredrik, and this is Consul Gollcher. It's a new photo. I haven't seen this photo before. It's at the War Archives in Stockholm. I found it just last week, actually, so it's quite recent, and I haven't seen it before. I don't know if any of you have seen it before. But it seems to be taken here in Valletta. So Olof Fredrik, as I told you, he settles in Malta. He becomes consul for Sweden and Malta, Sweden and Norway in 1874. And with him, we're back to the mummy Buchanan. And this is where I will start concluding my story about the Gollcher family. I was reading Fredrika Bremer and I saw the name Gollcher. I was doing investigations about Scandinavian travelers to Malta, and I saw the Gollcher name and I started to investigate. And I found the Gollcher business online, and I contacted Carl. I saw he's the consul for Sweden, and I emailed Carl, and he answered me back immediately and said, "This is a very interesting coincidence. I have just been contacted by an Egyptologist at the Mediterranean Museum in Stockholm, and she's trying to trace one of their Egyptian mummies." And I think this is just too good to be true, so I went to Stockholm and to the Mediterranean Museum, and this is what Caroline Johansson showed me. In the archives connected to the mummy, they found this small golden paper, and she had been looking at it and thinking about it and trying to trace it for weeks. And as you see, it says gåva, which is gift, off, and then it's actually, perhaps you can't see it here, but it's consul, and then F.A. Goll, and it says Gollcher, on Malta, and then 18, and then we couldn't see what year it was. And we worked on it, we're trying to trace it, and there's no F.A. Gollcher either. That's probably just a misspelling for O.F. And we were trying to trace it, we couldn't find it. And then Carl contacts me again and said, why don't you come and look at the Consular Archives? Perhaps we can find something there. So I came back to Malta, really warm September day. Carl and I, we started to going through the material, and I think it took 3 or 4 hours. After 3 or 4 hours, I find a small note saying that Consul Gollcher sent an Egyptian mummy with the ship Vanadis to the king and the National Museum in Stockholm. And he did that in 1870. So we found that we were very happy. We had good pasta, we celebrated. Anita made wonderful pasta. So it was a very nice evening. We were very happy and excited about this. So then we could take this information to the National Museum, and there we also found, because now we knew the year, so we found all the information in the museum archive also. This is the moment when we found the entry in the archives. Yes. So this is a really, of course, an important story that Olof Gollcher, the Consul Gollcher, he gave this Egyptian mummy as a gift to the Swedish king, and it was handed over to the National Museum in Stockholm. And I just want to mention before I finish the Consular Archives in Valletta that Carl and Mark so generously have opened up for me. That is a treasure of information about Swedish maritime history, about diplomatic relations between Sweden and Malta. There are many documents, not only private letters or diplomatic correspondence, but also very touching stories about Swedish sailors ending up in Malta, dying, and the correspondence between their mother trying to arrange for a grave for the son. And there are testimonies of shipwrecks and Swedish sailors surviving as only survivors. So it's a dramatic story that is told in these archives, both more private stories but also the official documents. And I have been in contact with historians at the University of Gothenburg, and especially an expert on consular activities in the Mediterranean during the 17th and 18th century, Joachim Östlund. And he says that at the National Archives, they have documentation from diplomatic relations between Sweden and Malta from 1874. And that's when Gollcher becomes consul. But this material is from 1822. So this historian, he was like almost fainting on the floor when we were talking about this, because this is really important material for research about Sweden, about Sweden's relation to Malta, and for the Swedish activities in the Mediterranean. Anton Larsson, I want to mention him because he has done such a good job. The student who has been working with the archival material has said that the Gollcher family could be described as a microcosm of the entire history of Gothenburg. From Johan Gottfried Gollcher, who landed here in the 1750s, the family have been present in all the strata of society and also upheld occupations that strongly anchors Gothenburg to a multitude of maritime activities. Coopers, officers, salesmen, coastal gunners, shipmen, shipbuilders, etc. And I would like to extend this a bit and say that the Gollcher family could function as a lens into the history of Sweden, from the social life on the islands of Gothenburg to the herring industry, which has been under-researched, to the harbours of Stockholm, and not least with the consular material, new research about Sweden's maritime history and its relation to the Mediterranean could be performed. There are many new fascinating stories that could be found and told. Thank you.